All right, great. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come before you acknowledging you are our creator. You have created everything seen and unseen by your spoken word, and you have done so for your own glory. We recognize and humble ourselves before you that you are our Redeemer, the one who has given us spiritual birth as well through the Lord Jesus Christ. And we thank you for him. We thank you, Lord Jesus, for your sacrifice on the cross for us. Father, you have made us with minds to know and to think and to reason and to wonder. And you've made us with hearts to have faith and to believe in you. And so I pray tonight those two things would come together. I pray that you would bless George. We thank you for his preparation. And as he leads us in this pivotal part of the book, this application part, Father, would you remind us that your word says that you have placed us in this time, at this time, and in this place for your purposes and for your reasons. And I pray that you would give us all great courage to face the days ahead. May we be faithful to Jesus, and may we glorify you in everything we say and do and how we respond in these dark times. We ask that you would make us lights in the midst of a dark and perverse generation. We ask all of this in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. All right. Well, I will start here with, again, a brief recap of what we've studied up to this point. And so, okay, here we are. All right, so this should look very familiar to those of you who have been joining us the last 3 weeks or so. So the Areopagus, our ministry, Rod Dreher, his previous book, The Benedict Option, and the present one, Live Not by Lies. Both should be absolutely required reading for serious Christians. I wrote a necessary preface to this book in which I tried to make the point that there are 3 issues on which we must be in general agreement if we're going to have any kind of profitable discussion or debate on a book like this. And that would go for any kind of discussion, debate with a fellow Christian or a non-Christian for that matter. But is American society becoming progressively better or worse? For many of us, that is an absolute no-brainer. But probably at least half the American people, if not more, would say that in their opinion, in general, things are getting better. You know, we're becoming more technologically sophisticated. Life is becoming more prosperous. Standards of living continue to rise and so on. And so for many people, that really is what matters, not values and moral and ethical principles and so on, spiritual principles. Secondly, is there a culture war going on in America? You would probably be very surprised and probably greatly disappointed how many Christian leaders and how many Christians in general dispute that fact that there is a culture war going on in America. It is a ferocious culture war, but many are in total denial. And is authentic Christianity countercultural? And I would say that throughout Christian history, yes, it always has been, going all the way back to the 1st century. The early church was very much countercultural, and true Christianity today would also be very countercultural, in contrast to a lot of what passes for Christian religion today. Political orientations, we've spent a few minutes on that in the past. Let's move on here. The neo-Marxist progressives who control and dominate American society and culture, if you could reduce their agenda down to a few points, I think it would be these. They are anti-Christian. They want to secularize America. What we find to be inspiring and a matter of pride in American heritage and history and so on, they find to be despicable and embarrassing. Again, it's like a clash of 2 different worldviews. So they want to secularize America. They want to sexualize America. And Millie, alluded to this with the story that came out recently. I think it was the city of Chicago public schools passing out condoms to 10-year-olds. Now, without going into detail, I'm not even sure what a 10-year-old boy would do. with one of those. But nonetheless, they are available on request, apparently. They want to racialize America and divide America. And that's, as you know, that's such a troubling trend. And that's why I've written this booklet, Critical Theory and Critical Race Theory, a Critical Analysis. They want to radically socialize America because they are socialists. Many of them are hardcore Marxists, and they politicize everything. So that's what we're faced with. And the quote from R.C. Sproul, which I know if you've been joining us the last 3 weeks, you've seen this 2 or 3 times at least, but it bears mentioning again. Sproul writes, "I doubt if there's been a period in all of Christian history when so many Christians are so ineffectual in terms of shaping the culture in which they live, as is true right now in the United States." Again, just incredibly shameful that he would have to make a statement like that, but his statement is absolutely correct. The idea of a culture war is not a popular topic, but in fact, there are 2 Americas. These 2 Americas' values and goals are totally incompatible, and the culture war is real, whether we prefer to acknowledge it or not. This quote from Robert George, you might recall from the article, the Benedict option and Live Not by Lies, a Necessary Preface. Robert George, professor of jurisprudence at Princeton, writes, "The days of comfortable and socially acceptable Christianity are over." Boy, we need to absorb that. One day, we're going to have to give an account for all we've done and failed to do, regardless of the pressures that we may be under currently or will be facing in the future. So in summary, American culture is rapidly degenerating into a new dark age marked by spiritual, moral, social, economic, and political chaos and collapse. If you keep up with the news, I don't think you have to be convinced. A culture war has been raging in America for decades, actually for centuries, but especially since the 1960s. And the forces of secular humanism are winning decisively. And thirdly, true Christianity has always functioned as a countercultural presence and a witness in opposition to a decadent world system that celebrates narcissism, hedonism, and materialism. And without a firm grasp of these truths, many readers of the Benedict option, Live Not by Lies, will flounder about in a perpetual state of mystification. And these are the kind of people who constantly complain, why can't we just be nice and get along? Millie alluded to what's going on in the United Methodist Church, where there are some very principled conservatives in the UMC standing for truth. Oftentimes, their churches, though, are full of these moderate compromisers. Why can't we all just be nice and get along? People who value in their minds, quote, unity over truth. And what that does is just concede the whole process to these radical progressive liberals who are trying to take over and totally dominate that denomination. And that's being played out in a lot of other churches and denominations as well, as I'm sure you're probably aware. So these are the kind of people who constantly cry peace, peace, when in fact there is no peace. So we talked about Rod Dreher. We talked about the thesis of his book, The United States Founded on a Judeo-Christian and Classical Liberal, you might say Republican-style government principles, has become expressly anti-liberal and pro-Christian. Actually, it's beyond that. It's more anti-Christian. Dreher says, we cannot hope to resist the coming soft totalitarianism if we do not have our spiritual lives in order. This is spiritual warfare we're talking about, but it plays out in the political realm, in the social, the cultural realm as well. But fundamentally, this is spiritual warfare. And in chapter 1, Dreher writes about anti-Christian totalitarian government poses the greatest threat to American society and culture in our nation's history. The times in which we're living are absolutely unprecedented in American history. Christians in America have been the most privileged, the most prosperous, and the most free Christians in all of Christian history. Now, no nation lasts forever, just like no kingdom or empire has ever lasted forever. And there's every reason to believe that America is on a very steep downward slide. But it doesn't lessen in any way our responsibility to stand for Christ. But few churches and Christian ministries are even attempting to prepare Christians for the challenges that lie ahead. And in chapter 2, Rod Dreher writes that under the right conditions, yes, totalitarianism can happen here. Chapter 3, progressivism as religion, and Eric led us through this chapter. The thesis being the myth of progress, Marxism as a secular religion, and the cult of so-called social justice. Once again, should Christians stand for social justice? Of course. Both the Old Testament and the New Testament are full of wisdom and understanding regarding what it means to live in as just and true a society as possible. But biblical social justice is absolutely the antithesis of left-wing Marxist progressive social justice. Chapter 4, again, Eric led us through this chapter, capitalism, woke and watchful. Thesis being woke capitalism is a natural ally of socialistic soft totalitarianism. This might strike many people as very odd because in the past, the general assumption was that corporations and capitalism and private enterprise in general are anti-socialistic, but you see how these two forces are coming together in recent years and promoting a form of big brother as big business. And Eric talked about China and what he called the mark of the East, you know, sort of a takeoff on the mark of the beast that we encounter in Revelation. Chapter 5, Larry Keener wrote and talked about courage is the most rare of all virtues. C.S. Lewis also emphasized that point in some of his writings. Of all the great virtues, courage is probably the most rare. Few are willing to speak the truth and endure the resulting suffering. Totalitarianism, socialism, communism, depends on the demoralization of people and the destruction of their hope, to where they're willing to just concede to the government things that rightly belong to the individual, and ultimately things that rightly belong to God. Living in truth, Dreher writes, is lonely, but it's also powerful and liberating if we truly see ourselves as dissidents and as a Christian counterculture. Then I think we can face what's coming in the future with far more resolute courage and hope and all. We're not supposed to be mainstream in every respect, but for too often Christians have labored under that misconception. Chapter 6, cultivate cultural memory. Young people are attracted to socialism because they know very little of true history. History and the teaching of history, as you know, is being very much perverted and distorted in public schools and private schools as well, and even in many so-called Christian schools. Schools, homes, and churches should be centers of true education, but oftentimes schools, homes, and churches are anything but centers of true education. So Rod Dreher would encourage us to create small fortresses of memory, as he calls it, in our homes and in the church. Chapter 7, families are resistant cells. The thesis is strong family ties and values are an indispensable bulwark against totalitarianism. Families are the first line of defense against lies, such as the lies that we're constantly being inundated with, you know, in the news, in the media, and so on. Pope John Paul II put it this way: as the family goes, so goes the nation, and so goes the whole world in which we live. Cherish truth-telling, but Rod Dreher cautions, we need to be prudent and discerning. We don't go looking to pick fights. And furthermore, we don't go looking to be a martyr. If it comes to us, then we accept it by grace and by faith. But be prudent and be discerning. Many Christians and other Americans who stand for truth have already become victims of discrimination, what Rod Dreher calls soft persecution. And that will continue to be the case as we move forward from now on. So, brief review of where we've been, and let me opt out of this, go back to our main page. And I'm really delighted to have George Weaver with us this evening. George Weaver, as many of you know, is an attorney. He also serves on our Areopagus Board of Directors and is a real source of insight and wisdom when it comes to the issues that we've been talking about and certainly will this evening. So George, thank you, and certainly looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And I'm going to display the outline that should have been sent to everybody. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So I was given the assignment of summarizing chapters 8, 9, and 10 and the conclusion of the book. And so I'm just going to go through that. And then after that, I want to the extent we have time, I want to ask some questions and provoke a discussion. So chapter 8 presents the thesis that religion is the bedrock of resistance to this soft tyranny that Dreher is warning against. And he gives a number of accounts of Christians persecuted under communism. And throughout the book, of course, as you know, from listening to the presentations this summer and reading the book, if you have, Dreher sees an analogy between our society today in the West, in particular the United States, and what existed under communism before the fall of the Soviet Union, beginning in 1989. And although he does say that we don't really face the same kinds of threats, but he describes it, as I mentioned, as a soft tyranny instead of a hard tyranny where you face arrest and imprisonment and torture and things like that. But anyway, he sees benefit in talking about a lot of these people in communist countries who were persecuted for their faith and how they showed courage in the face of persecution. So here are some of the ones he mentions. The Sylvester Cremery, I'm probably saying that wrong, a Czech physician who was imprisoned for 13 or 14 years. And Dreher interviewed a lot of these people. And apparently he traveled to Europe and to to Russia, and he tracked these people down and sat down and interviewed them. But anyway, this Sylvester Cremery says, despite his treatment, his persecution, that, quote, there could not be anything more beautiful than to lay down my life for God. And he compared his attitude to that of Peter in the Gospels, where he closes his eyes and relies on faith and attempts to follow Jesus in walking on water. You know the account. But Cremery says he memorized scripture to get through prison and prayed for his captors. And he helped organize the 1988 candle demonstration in Bratislava, which was part of Czechoslovakia in the Soviet Empire, leading to the 1989 Velvet Revolution and the overthrow of communist rule. Dreher also raises the example of Richard Wurmbrandt, a Lutheran pastor who was imprisoned for 14 years in Romania. You may know his story. He wrote Tortured for Christ, which was his best-selling book, and other books, including In God's Underground. He also founded Voice of the Martyrs. He's now passed away. But as Cremery, Wurmbrandt showed forgiveness for his captors and persecutors. In fact, I recall from that book, Tortured for Christ, that Wurmbrandt says that the last thing he did before he left Romania was to put a flower on the grave of the officer who ordered his arrest. So let me see if I can move. Other examples that Dreher lists of Christians in under communist rule and persecution displaying courage. Other examples include the ones on this slide that you see. Farther, Dmitry Dudko, a Russian Orthodox priest imprisoned for 8 years in the USSR. Viktor Popkov, a Christian convert in the Soviet Union, sentenced to prison in 1980. George, and I can't pronounce that, Kalsu, a Romanian Orthodox priest who served 2 prison sentences. And Dreher emphasizes that George Kalsu encouraged Christians to boldly proclaim the resurrection, as in the book of Acts. And then he also cites the case of Alexander Ogorodnikov, who was imprisoned in the Soviet Union. And Dreher mentions an example of how Ogorodnikov was thrown into a cell full of cynical, skeptical inmates. And he mentioned his Christian faith. And these other inmates said, well, you know, if your God's real, then have him provide some cigarettes. So a guard came by, I guess, shortly after that and threw cigarettes into the cell. And this was considered to be sort of, I guess, like the Old Testament example of Elijah calling down fire and proving, you know, to skeptical people the existence of God. Dreher concludes chapter 8 by saying this, quote, and this is a theme he repeats throughout the book. Jeffrey's already mentioned it tonight. Quote, a time of painful testing, even persecution is coming. Lukewarm or shallow Christians will not come through with their faith intact. And then he refers to the dilemma or the choice that we have to make. Are we going to be admirers of Christ only, or are we going to be followers? And he borrows that from Soren Kierkegaard, who was a Christian, quote, existentialist from Denmark. And we'll get to that in a minute because he brings it up in a later chapter. But so Dreher continues, quote, we will know when we act or fail to act as Christians, when to be faithful costs us something. It may be a small thing at first, a place on a sports team because we won't play on Sunday mornings, or the respect of our peers, when we will not march in a parade for a political cause. And a footnote here, if you're employed by a company that wants you to participate in a quote, pride parade, LGBTQ plus parade, then you would be facing this issue. Dreher continues, but the demands made on us will grow greater and the consequences for failing to submit to the world's demands will grow more severe. So that's chapter 8. Chapter 9, Dreher titles it Standing in Solidarity. And another word that could be used for solidarity is unity. When I first saw him mention solidarity, I thought he was talking about the Union of Workers in Poland, but he means unity. Dreher again gives examples of Christians in communist countries standing with solidarity or unity. And this is evidence he cites throughout the book. The behavior of Christians under communist rule and challenging Christians in the West to follow their example. And the first example in chapter 9 of solidarity or unity is from Czechoslovakia or Bratislava, Slovakia, which was part of Czechoslovakia under Soviet rule. And there was a house where Christian materials were printed and then distributed, despite the risk of being apprehended and prosecuted and sentenced to prison. He goes back to a theme that he repeats again throughout the book, and Jeffrey's also mentioned it, of small groups and communities. And this would include families. He quotes a gentleman named František Miklosko, a leader of the Slovak underground church, saying, quote, "It is harder to tell who is the enemy." That's because of the liberalization that's occurred since the fall of the Soviet Union. And so I understand Dreher to be saying here, by quoting this Miklosko, that this increases the need for small groups and communities because you know the people in your small group. If you don't have a small group, then you may not know who is supporting you or who's opposing you. Dreher also comes back to courage. He says courage is contagious, and when preachers and pastors were imprisoned, others stood up to fill their shoes. He continues in chapter 9, quoting a pastor who says, quote, 60 years of terror, they were unable to get rid of the faith. It was saved specifically in small groups, close quote. And Dreher points out, citing this pastor, that this occurred without literature and organizations. Dreher goes on to quote a Russian Baptist pastor named Yuri Sipko, who says that in modern day Russia, since the fall of the Iron Curtain, it's easy to obtain a Bible. It's easy to meet for worship services and find religious teaching. I wasn't really aware that it was that easy, but I guess it is, unlike, let's say, China. But Sipko says that Christians in Russia today have been seduced by materialism and social standing, this competition for social standing. Dreher goes on to say in chapter 9 that, quote, it's unlikely that American Christians will be threatened for going to church, but it's quite likely institutional churches and ministers will continue to be inadequate to the challenge of forming their congregations for effective resistance. And we'll come back to that in a minute when we have our discussion. In chapter 9, Dreher goes on. He says, quote, intense, committed small groups styled after those of the Soviet era could be indispensable, and Christians of every church should start forming these cells, not simply to deepen its members' spiritual lives, but to train them in active resistance, close quote. He says also that this solidarity mechanism or unity that he's supporting would be a rebellion against contemporary atomization. And by that, I take him to mean that we tend to be isolated. You know, we're focused on our social media accounts. We don't even know our neighbors. And this support or this mechanism of solidarity with small groups and communities would help to counteract that. And Dreher says, quote, only in solidarity with others can we find the spiritual and communal strength to resist, close quote. And a little bit surprising, Dreher says that Christians should make common cause with secular dissidents. He says, quote, Christians must act to build bonds of brotherhood across denominational and international lines, and also with people of goodwill belonging to other religions and no religion at all. But he goes on to say that today most liberals, you know, some of them might support the rights of Christians to stand where they do on certain cultural issues like, say, abortion and marriage and physician-assisted suicide and so forth. But Dreher says some liberals might support Christians, but most liberals seem to think that the kind of oppression coming against religious believers is justified, even necessary. Now we come to the final chapter, chapter 10, where Dreher talks about the, quote, gift of suffering. That's his title for the chapter. And he points out that American culture is allergic to difficulty, adversity, and suffering. And he gives an example like a young woman might be irritated by her husband and children, so she bails out of her marriage and puts the kids in daycare. And then he comes back to his theme of communist regimes. He gives more examples of suffering under severe persecution that strengthen Christian faith. And these examples include, in chapter 10, Maria Komaromi. You know, these names are kind of like reading the Old Testament, the book of Numbers or Chronicles, trying to pronounce them. Maria Komaromi, a Catholic teacher in Budapest, Hungary. Maria Bittner, same first name, another Hungarian, was sentenced to death, although her sentence was not carried out. But a number of people, Christians apparently, in her prison were hung. And this is in Hungary, the country of Hungary. And then he mentions a film, a 2019 film called A Hidden Life by Terrence Malick, based on the life of Franz Jagerstätter, an Austrian Catholic farmer who refused to serve in the Nazi army and swear loyalty to Adolf Hitler. He was executed in 1943, later pronounced a saint by Pope Benedict XVI. I had not heard of that movie. Have any of y'all seen that movie?
Yes, this is Jay. That movie was mentioned by one of the pastors during the Sunday service. So I think that a lot of people watched that movie. I got that from Netflix and watched it. I think it's absolutely a must for Christian. I very highly recommend it.
Okay. It sounds kind of like
Watched it we watched it last night. I've been looking for it for a year. It came out in 2019. We
Okay.
just finally found it, and it's a masterpiece, just like Brewer says.
Okay. It sounds like a story similar to Bonhoeffer. Chapter 10 continues with a list of Christians who resisted totalitarianism imposed by communist regimes. He mentions again the Sylvester Kremery, the physician in Czechoslovakia or Slovakia, who refused, quote, to hate, to rebel, or even to complain, close quote, against his oppressors. And this goes back to the title or theme of this chapter, which is about suffering. The Christian should embrace suffering. He also mentions Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who found a way to bless his prison, in the Gulag system in the Soviet Union as a gift somehow. And then he mentions again another name that has already been referred to, Alexander Ogorodnikov, who was imprisoned for 9 years. He claimed a vision from God that kept him going in prison, and he recounted stories of unspeakable cruelty told by a prison guard. For example, the execution by the KGB of priests who refused to deny Christ. And then he talks about Wurmbrand again, and he quotes from Wurmbrand's testimony to a Senate committee in the US Congress. And then he also repeats this concept from Søren Kierkegaard, the Christian existentialist who was from Denmark, who said of Christ, quote, his whole life on earth from beginning to end was destined solely to have followers and to make admirers impossible. Finally, in chapter 10, Dreher says, quote, the old totalitarianism conquered societies through fear of pain. The new one will, imposing soft totalitarianism, will conquer primarily through manipulating people's love of pleasure and fear of discomfort. You may remember Francis Schaeffer, and who's died some years ago, but he sort of inspired a lot of young people to reconsider and then embrace Christianity, including me, for example. But he said, I think it was in How Shall We Then Live, he said that the two dominant themes in Western society or the highest goods that people seek are personal peace and affluence. And that echoes what Dreher is saying here, that soft totalitarianism will conquer primarily through manipulating people's love of pleasure and fear of discomfort. Dreher emphasizes that Christians should not seek suffering, but should endure it without bitterness when it comes, like the examples he mentions, including Wurmbrand. And he cites Matthew 5:44, part of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them who hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. And then Dreher summarizes by saying, quote, the faith of martyrs and confessors like those who survive to bear witness is a far cry from the therapeutic religion of the middle-class suburbs, the sermonizing of politicized congregations of the left and the right, and the health and wealth message of prosperity gospel churches. These and other feeble forms of the faith will be quickly burned away in the face of the slightest persecution. Then in the part of the book that he calls the conclusion, Dreher again lists Christians who suffered and endured persecution under communist rule. He mentions this Timo Kritska, and whose great-grandfather was a Greek Catholic priest in Bratislava who suffered from his refusal of a government order to convert to the Orthodox Church. Another one of these Christians who suffered under communist rule said that he had moments, quote, like paradise, close quote, when thrown into solitary confinement. And then he ends his conclusion with another discussion of the emerging totalitarianism, he says, which is, quote, softer, smarter, and more sophisticated, but no less totalitarian for it. And he repeats some themes from the Benedict option that Jeffrey mentions, saying here, quote, the culture war is largely over and we lost, close quote. But the final page of his conclusion is a reference again to Solzhenitsyn, that if we are united, I guess, if we practice solidarity, then the resistance to this soft tyranny can grow and can be effective. That's a summary of chapters 8, 9, and 10, and the conclusion of Dreher's book. So let me ask this question, and I'll open this up for discussion. Have you ever been pressured not to practice your Christian faith or punished for doing so?
So you'd like a response from?
Yeah, feel free to give me your thoughts or your experiences.
Well, I know my first job out of college was with Capitol Records back in the early to mid 1970s, and it was an exceedingly hedonistic environment, as you might imagine. That was the that was the company of, you know, in earlier years, the Beach Boys, and then the Beatles, and so on. It was just assumed that one would hold to modernistic secular values and all. So the very idea that especially a Christian would want to be involved in an industry like that was virtually unthinkable, I'm sure, to a lot of people. So back then, you know, in my early 20s and all, I certainly felt the pressure. And it wasn't that I, you know, refused to speak out in terms of my faith, but it certainly is a force to be reckoned with. And,
anybody else?
Well, this is Debbie Kochuk, and I wanted to share that when I was in my medical technology internship at a hospital, my roommate, the first night she asked me to tell me all about her, tell her all about myself, and so I shared my faith. She hated Christians, so she turned a lot of people against me, including the main professor that we had, the woman in charge of the program. And I just went through a lot that year with people saying terrible things to me. And the thing that saved me was God showed me to walk strong with him in his word, that it was most important that I know his word, stay in his word. And that's what encouraged me and helped me get through that year. But you know, there were people that liked me and that were encouraged me, but I had a lot of Christian persecution that year.
did she ever explain why she was so hostile toward Christians?
She didn't believe in God, and she was doing drugs. She was the smartest one in our class. There were only 5 of us. And she was the teacher's pet. And she just was very loud and smart. And she knew some Christians in college, and she just hated them. She hated what they stood for. And it was really interesting because I heard her talking. She was my roommate for a while, and then she asked to be moved, or she asked for me to be kicked out of the room. And I told her, I'm not going to be kicked out. I don't have any problem with you. If you've got the problem with me, you need to leave. But I heard her talking on the phone one night to somebody, and she said, what gets me the most is she's so nice to me all the time. And she hated that I would treated her nicely and didn't curse at her and, you know, whatever.
Oh my.
Anybody else have an experience you want to share?
This is Che. I think it's very common knowledge that in most very liberal universities, particularly Ivy School, if you are Republican, I was told that you just forget about getting tenure. That's what I was told. If you're Republican, just forget it.
Many of you probably remember a sociology professor at Kennesaw State University, Melvin Fine. Melvin was a very good friend of mine, and probably some of the rest of you knew him as well. Now, Melvin was not a Christian. He was a secular Jew, but Melvin was also very resolutely, demonstrably, outspokenly conservative. And, you know, in a field like sociology, conservatives would be probably as rare as Christians. But I always had a lot of admiration and respect for Melvin because he held these strong beliefs, and he was absolutely, he would not bow to those in his department and in the university in general, who would tend to put so much pressure on faculty. In fact, he was actually denied tenure early in his time there at Kennesaw State, even though he had written more, published more than most anybody else in the department. And so Melvin was a real bulldog. He understood his rights and was not about to cave in to all this progressive left-wing pressure. So he actually initiated a lawsuit against the university, and on the basis of discrimination. And the university caved almost immediately because it obviously had to do with his political beliefs. Now, the same thing, of course, would be true, I'm sure, in many cases that we've heard of regarding Christians as well. But again, going back to C.S. Lewis's idea that of all the virtues, courage apparently is the most rare. And very,
You're
very,
right.
very,
Melvin,
very humbling.
Melvin was very courageous. You're correct. And this is Jerry Kochik. If I might interject something that doesn't apply to George's questions, but it seems to me that this book was copyrighted in 2020. So Dreher probably wrote it 2019 BC before COVID. And because in chapter 9, when George mentioned that it's unlikely that American Christians will be threatened to going to church, I thought about them shutting down worship services and how pastors have been arrested for holding services in Canada and various states in the US, Louisiana and Alabama. And so, you know, it kind of struck me when I heard that part. You know, there's told not to go to church, and don't you dare hold a Christian service. And the casinos were open, the abortuaries were open, no problem. That's a necessary service, but a church service is not. So he's already a little, chapter 9 part of it, slightly a little bit anachronistic at this point.
Very good point. Yeah.
Good point. Well, let me throw in a little aside here on courage. I wrote a book years ago called Faking It by a guy named William Ian Miller. And he's a law professor at Michigan. But he argues in there, and I think he's correct, his conclusion's correct, that courage is the only virtue that you cannot fake. If you act courageous, then by definition, you are courageous. Now, you can fake kindness and love and patience and so forth, but you can't really fake courage. So one conclusion to draw from that is that if you act courageous, then by definition, you are courageous. So that might inspire us to just act courageous. But let me move to the second question here. Are you aware of others who've been pressured or punished? And of course, we all are. Dreher mentions in his book, Brendan Eich, who was the CEO of Mozilla, which owns Firefox. It's a web browser. And Ike contributed, I think, $1,000 in California to the opposition to same-sex marriage, or in support of Proposition 8, which would have maintained the traditional opposite-sex male-female definition of marriage. But Ike was, roasted for that, and he got a lot of pressure from the company for taking that position, so he resigned. Now, I think he has formed other businesses since, but he actually wrote JavaScript, I believe, a brilliant guy. But there are other examples too, not ones mentioned by Dreher, but you all know the story of Jack Phillips, the Masterpiece Cake Shop baker in Colorado, who had to go to the US Supreme Court to secure his right not to bake a wedding cake for a same-sex wedding. And the Supreme Court's opinion, I think it was Anthony Kennedy again. I'm not an admirer of Anthony Kennedy, but it was very limited and narrow, and it didn't really provide adequate guidance for future cases. But now Phillips has been sued again for refusing to bake a transgender cake. Some woman, I guess, who's announced that she's going to become a male, apparently asked Jack Phillips, the baker, to bake a cake that was blue on the outside and pink on the inside, and he declined, and so she has sued him for that. But other examples of pressure, and they're so numerous, it's hard, you can't really catalog them, but Fox Sports fired a commentator named James Craig probably 6 or 7 years ago, because Craig, who was an athlete, when he ran for public office in Texas, was defeated, but in the campaign, he took a position against same-sex marriage. And this is before Obergefell. But because of that, Fox Sports fired him. And then you may know about the cases involving florists who declined to provide floral arrangements for same-sex weddings. Like there was one in Washington State named Baronella Stutzman, and she was found to have engaged in discrimination unlawful under Washington law, and was fined. And just this year, last month, the US Supreme Court declined to hear her case. And there are other cases involving photographers who've declined to participate or take photographs for same-sex weddings, quote unquote. Like there was a case out of New Mexico, Elane, E-L-A-N-E Photography, which it was owned by a married man and woman couple, and they were fined and punished for refusing to provide photography services to a same-sex wedding. And the Supreme Court in 2014 refused to hear their case. So there are a lot of examples of Christians being pressured or punished for practicing their faith.
George, there's one that's even closer to home. Calvin Cochran, the Atlanta fire chief, lost his job because he wrote a book for his men's Bible study. It's about Adam and Eve, who told you they were naked. And there's only 2.5 pages on various sexuality issues.
You're talking about Calvin Cochran, the Atlanta police chief, fire chief?
Yeah, Atlanta fire chief Calvin Cochran.
He sued.
He won his case. He sued his case.
He got a big settlement.
It took several years, and that was the dream of life, to be a fire chief. And he had been for a number of years, very highly respected in his job.
The mayor who fired him, and Reed, by the way, used to oppose same-sex marriage. All these people are hypocrites, by the way.
And now Reed's running again for mayor.
Yeah. So there are many examples of Christians who've been pressured or punished, and we're focusing mainly here on Christians taking positions on some of these cultural issues. But Christians can also be punished for sharing their faith, you know, the gospel. So let's talk about a critique of this book, Live Not by Lies.
George,
Yes.
George, this is Debbie Coach. Excuse me for interrupting. I was on a mission trip to the islands, Canary Islands, yeah. And they told us that we were passing out flyers. We were going to have a festival, and you know, we were going to have Christian singing and a preacher, but we were going to have all kinds of stuff for the kids, and of course we were going to share the gospel. But they told us that we were not allowed to put any kind of flyers in anybody's mailbox, that because it was, you know, kind of a Christian thing. We could talk to people, we could hand it to a person, but we were not allowed to put stuff in the mailboxes, which was really kind of
Well,
bizarre.
we had arranged to do it in a certain field at one point one evening, and they said, no, you can't do it there. So at the last minute, we had to find a new place, and we did it in between a couple of apartment buildings where people were coming out on the apartment balconies and kind of watching this, and some came out. So it they made it difficult, but we overcame.
Yeah. Let me just ask that second question on the slide that you're looking at now. Do you think Dreher's made a convincing case? Or question number 3, has he overstated the problem? What do you think?
Well, this book is, of course, a follow-up of sorts to the Benedict option. And it seems to me that the evidence is overwhelming and incontrovertible that, again, it comes back to one of those 3 basic questions. Is our society becoming progressively better or worse? And unless your standard of measurement is purely materialistic, or based on, you know, hedonistic impulses or whatever, I think anybody with a strong moral conscience has to be extremely concerned. I mean, just look at last year with the just unprecedented level of violence in American cities. And total disregard for the rule of law. We now have a president of the United States who, as far as I know, is the only president we've ever had that actually has encouraged people to break our laws. And that is through, you know, his border policies. He's sworn to uphold the rule of law and the constitutional rule of law in America. He has absolutely no intention of doing so. And that's just, I think, an example of many that we could cite about the just absolute breakdown of morality and civility and decency. And again, respect for law in our society. So I think Dreher makes a very convincing case.
I think his case is convincing, but even if it weren't, I think a lot of his suggestions are good anyway, especially when it comes to, you know, family life and how should families deal with being part of a culture that's hostile to their values. I really think that's the most important part of the book, because ultimately it's, you know, it's how our children are going to come out of it that's important. And I think Dreher does a very good job of showing how families are critical to preserving Christianity and how to go about doing that.
Good point.
And George, I would answer your question, has he made a convincing case, by saying it depends on who you're trying to convince. I think it would take a whole lot more background for him than this book provides for him to convince you know, a left-leaning liberal that this is a real problem. He's kind of preaching to the choir to us, obviously, but if you're trying to convince a hardcore liberal, and I'm trying to put myself in their shoes and reading this book, I'm not sure I would be convinced.
Yeah.
But again, it would probably take a 2,000-page tome of world history to convince anyone. And of course, nobody's getting that kind of world history nowadays. So,
Could I make a comment? A couple comments. This is Ari. You know, there's some church doctrines, and I mean, I respect everybody with different doctrinal beliefs, but I just want to raise the possibility that perhaps maybe belief in a pre-tribulation rapture, you know, has maybe is not really helping Christians prepare either for preserving the freedom we have and not having to go through persecution, or just having the feeling like they're going to be raptured before it gets really bad. That's one thing. And then maybe there's like some branch of Calvinistic theology, I'm not sure if it's called dominion or whatever, but or maybe like the post-millennial return of Christ believes that the church will evangelize the whole world and basically before Jesus comes again. So things are getting better and better in that sense, that the church will be triumphant. And maybe, I mean, a lot of them are very much aware of persecution, but I wonder if you believe that, then you might be so optimistic that you might think it could never happen here in America. That's one thing. And then another thing is, I don't know how y'all feel about having to take the vaccine, but there's a big division. I'm against taking the vaccine myself, and I can't go to family reunions. My own immediate family, you know, brothers and sisters and parents are pressuring me to take it. And I think the whole COVID lockdown and masking and vaccine and you know, is based on a lot of lies and misinformation. And let me make an analogy to Nazi Germany for a second. You know, the Jews, you know, the one way that the Germans were rallied to dehumanize the Jews is by thinking they were dirty or vermin. You know, and now the people who are vaccinated are thinking that those of us who are unvaccinated are a danger to them, and that they probably wouldn't mind if the government kind of rounded us up and quarantined us and put us first in detention camps or whatever. And so those of us, those Christians on the other side who think that, you know, that everybody should be, it's obvious that you should get vaccinated. You know, if you're not able to see through the lies of this issue, then aren't you kind of repeating, going down possibly the same road that the Germans did in Nazi Germany, is to demonize a whole segment of society and basically be okay with getting rid of them?
Anybody else have a comment?
Well, I would definitely agree that someone's eschatology is going to play a large role in their reaction to a lot of things. You know, I think, yeah, people with a certain view of Revelation and or the rapture are going to respond basically saying we don't care. And other people with other views will get very paranoid and think everything is a conspiracy, while people with other views will think that everything's just going to be fine. We don't have to worry about it. But a lot of people think eschatology is this pie in the sky stuff, but I agree it definitely affects how we respond to the present day, because that's going to reflect what we think is going to happen. So I think, I mean, I would agree eschatology plays a large role in how people react to all kinds of current events.
Well, let me say this. By the way, I do support the vaccine. I think it's proven to be very safe. and I've been vaccinated. Everybody in my family's been vaccinated, and I would encourage you, Ari, to take the vaccine. But that's not really the issue on the table here. There certainly is a collapse of moral standards in our society today. Jeffrey mentioned some examples. But the question I'm thinking of here in the slide that you're looking at is whether Dreher has made a convincing case that Christians face this soft tyranny problem. And what I would say about that is, I think he does overstate the danger from technology. Like early in the book, this was not in the part that I covered, but early in the book, he talks about smart speakers and digital assistants, Siri and Alexa and so forth, and that your conversations could be monitored and you could, in theory, be persecuted or ostracized or stigmatized because of your private conversation. Well, I think technology inevitably involves a loss of some privacy. For example, aerial surveillance. Law enforcement, just like the military, uses aerial surveillance. And they can see what you're doing in your backyard if they want to. That doesn't bother me, but you can see that as a loss of privacy. Doorbell cameras like Ring. People drive up and down the street or they come to your door. You can, you can get a video or a picture of them. Again, a loss of privacy in theory. There are all kinds of databases that contain tremendous amounts of details about all of us, including our finances, our credit, our medical records and so forth, auto ownership, driver's license records, firearms purchases. And a lot of this stuff is on cloud storage servers. And we don't really know who might look at that material, and it could be hacked. But I really think, in my opinion, Dreher does overstate the danger from technology, drawing a connection between that and this threat of soft tyranny. Now, there certainly is an increasing tendency to ostracize and stigmatize, like I said, Christians because of their stance on moral issues. But in my opinion, he does overstate that. Now, one thing he doesn't talk about is, we're running out of time here, but one reason that Christianity and the church, the Christian church and religion in general has declined in influence in our society is because of the increasing number of people who are unaffiliated. And this would include, and here's a slide from a Pew Research Center study in 2014. I like this study because it surveyed 30,000 people. And Pew has not repeated this since 2014 to my knowledge. But it shows that an increasing number of people in the US are unaffiliated, that is atheist, agnostic, or have no religion. And a decreasing number, let me go back here. A decreasing number profess to be Christians. And this next slide is from the same study by Pew Research Center. And it shows that, especially among younger generations, like millennials and Generation X people, that the numbers of unaffiliated are rapidly increasing, and the number of those who profess Christian belief or faith is declining. And here's a more recent study from Gallup showing again some of these statistics. And you can see the millennials and the Generation Xers and the baby boomers and traditionalists. You can see the comparison, how, and at the top of the slide, it says, this represents the percentage of US adults with no religious affiliation by generation. And for millennials, it's up to 31% as of 2018 to 2020. And I think that is one of the main reasons why the church has become ineffective. And the views that Christians espouse, like supporting the right to life, maintaining the traditional definition of marriage and so forth, those views are considered to be out of date and unacceptable now because there are fewer Christians around to espouse those views. One of the things, and let me wrap up with this, Solzhenitsyn, whose statement is the source for the title of this book by Dreher, Live Not by Lies. But Solzhenitsyn at Harvard in 1978 said, and this is a very powerful address that he made. Solzhenitsyn was invited to Harvard to give the commencement address in 1978. And of course, Harvard is extremely left-wing. And what I have read indicates that the administration at Harvard thought that Solzhenitsyn was going to praise Western society. You know, he was an immigrant from the Soviet Union, and he was basically expelled from his home country. And so Harvard expected him to praise the West and basically indict communism. But Solzhenitsyn turned the tables, and he said, I won't read this whole thing, but he said that what struck him most about Western society was a decline in courage. And he said in the second line there, quote, the Western world has lost its civil courage. Continuing in the next sentence, such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling groups and the intellectual elite, causing an impression of loss of courage by the entire society. And I think this fits with Dreher's theme that we as Christians need to be courageous in stating our faith, sharing our faith, and standing up for Christian values. One thing that you could do, this just occurred to me in preparing for tonight, is take a look at churches and their stances on same-sex marriage. Now, Johnson Ferry Baptist has posted online its policy that weddings must be between one biological man and one biological woman. Now compare that to, this is Glenn Memorial United Methodist Church, which is at Emory University. It says in the fourth or fifth line, we are grateful that we're able to welcome to our worship venues the wedding between members of the LGBTQ+ community with the same sanctity and celebration that we do any wedding. And then it goes on to condemn the Methodist prohibition on performing same-sex marriages. But they say that that's unjust and contrary to the teachings of Jesus. So that's just one way that you can see whether a church or a body of believers is courageous or not. Look at what they say about same-sex marriage. And I'm thinking back to the Benedict option by Dreher. He says in that book that the Obergefell decision in 2015, where the Supreme Court invented out of thin air a right to same-sex marriage, which has no basis in either the language, text, or history of the Constitution. He said that that was like the death knell for conservatives in the culture war. And I think he's probably right. But there is some basis for optimism. Next year, the Supreme Court is supposed to decide a case from Mississippi that could overturn Roe versus Wade, another outrageous decision like Obergefell. So there's some hope that things can be perhaps turned around to some extent, or at least our moral decline can be slowed. So that's what I have to say, and it's almost 8:30, so I'll go ahead and stop at this point.
Well, George, thank you very much. Very, very insightful, informative. And going back to this statement by Glenn Memorial United Methodist Church over by Emory, it's a good reminder that, and I know that oftentimes conservative Christians are accused of being single issue voters and so on, oftentimes related to the abortion issue, or maybe even the LGBTQ agenda and so on. But I would just ask this question. Any church that lacks the moral clarity, such as we see in that statement from Glenn Memorial UMC, would you trust a church like that to be an authority on any topic whatsoever, be it morality or theology, or not to mention politics and so on? Likewise, if somebody is confused on the abortion issue, is that anyone whose opinions you would tend to take seriously on any moral, ethical issue? I certainly would not. I mean, there are a lot of gray areas in life, obviously, but when it comes to issues like abortion, the sanctity of life, and issues such as same-sex marriage and transgenderism, and that sort of thing, I believe these are about as clear-cut and definite as any issues that I can possibly imagine. So, they'll of course, as I said, accuse us of just being single issue voters and all. But when you think about it, if we don't believe in the sanctity of life and the right to life, then all other rights and all that human beings supposedly have would be irrelevant anyway. But thanks. You really brought up some interesting points. I wanted to just real quickly here allude to on page 2 of your outline, that's chapter 9, about midway down. Rod Dreher is talking about it's quite likely that institutional churches and ministers will continue to be inadequate to the challenge of forming their congregations for effective resistance. And I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts related to that idea in particular. Institutional churches and ministers will continue to be inadequate to the challenge of forming their congregations for effective resistance in light of all this incredible immoral pressure that Christians are under these days and in recent years.
I have a comment, Jeffrey.
Yes, Bob.
I think it's a faith issue. I think if talking about the preachers in that last quote, if they could develop in their congregations or encourage in their congregations faith in the living God that is worthy of our obedience, and I think that's where the courage comes from. When I think of the martyrs that were alluded to, or the people that didn't end up being martyrs, but they're persecuted, I don't think they were necessarily just courageous people. I think they were people of extreme faith, and they were going to stick to their guns to their faith. And so if the churches can't help us to have a living faith, then we won't have the courage. If it's a real thing and not just a made up thing, then we'll have the courage to stand up. At least some of us will. So I don't think it's just intestinal fortitude. I think it's a matter of faith.
I agree. Thank you. I appreciate that, Bob. And by the way, you might want to notice behind you there.
Yeah.
Yeah, the alligator.
I'm speaking to you from Ocala, Florida. That was 2 days ago.
Oh, wow.
Other thoughts? Yes, Jack.
Jeffrey, yes, this is Jack Conlon. Look, I've been listening to this. Thank you, George, for leading us through that final series of chapters with Mr. Dreyer's book. I think there's just a loud clarion call for Christians to look very seriously at the Christian communities we fellowship with, not with a sense of judgment, but with a sense of searching. We need to draw together with those who get it. This whole woke culture around us that would suggest that there is a culture around us that has been awakened to what is a real sense of right, kind of a new dawn of realization of what's real. And they just have it all wrong. We on this call know that. We are the true woke community, awakened to what is the real light of Scripture and of the reality of God. And in this culture that's just collapsing around us, our families are exposed, and we need to draw together as a community. I'm really seeking a community here in this new city that I've moved to, that I can begin to find friends and Christian brothers and sisters who sense this concern about our broader nation and world around us, and can at least draw together in a community to minister to each other, encourage each other, equip each other for true love and good works, and then to boldly reach out in the community around us to invite others to share the true light of Jesus Christ. And so I'm hearing that call to real community, and I just want to be able to respond to that.
Yes, thank you. And in many people's case, this probably would come outside of just their church. We do need strong support groups and strong groups that we can bare our soul and be accountable before. And again, if we can't find that within our particular church, then by all means, let's broaden our search. And I know one of the things we'd like to do in the next year with the Areopagus is start a network of Watchman style ministries, Christians who are aware of what's going on and concerned about the dangers that we face spiritually as well as every other respect, and organizing on a community-wide basis. So I think it's just absolutely imperative, as this society and this culture become increasingly hostile toward our values and beliefs. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Jeffrey, this is Jay.
Yes, Jay.
Even in the most conservative church, I believe the PCA is probably one of the more conservative denominations. But even in conservative churches, they discourage discussion about this cultural moral issues under the pretense of peace, unity, and purity and peace within the church. So what I haven't argued is that even though we have different perspective on moral and political, whatever cultural issues, we are under the big banner of our love for Christ and love for one another. we have much bigger unifying force within us. So if we don't feel safe to discuss different viewpoint on this, where else could we go? So that I've been arguing, but it still doesn't work. I mean, the church should be the safest place to voice different opinion about this moral and cultural issue, because we have more in common than the difference on these cultural issues. So, church should be the best place to bring all this thing out and have a very free discussion. But church is most inhibitive and prohibitive organization to discussing under the banner, under the pretext of, we need to be loving, unity, peace, and purity. And I said, that is false pretense. If we cannot freely discuss this thing in church, where else can we go? We have no other place to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you, Jay. And by the way, you might recall that Andrew Brunson, in his book and in our forum a few months ago when we had him come speak, he addresses that very issue. And that is that evangelical churches in general tend to define discipleship very, very narrowly. They essentially reduce discipleship to what Francis Schaeffer, George mentioned Francis Schaeffer earlier this evening and how much influence Francis Schaeffer had on his life. Likewise, I would say the same thing. But this is what Francis Schaeffer referred to as pietism. And it's a very, very narrow view of Christian discipleship. Discipleship needs to be holistic and encompass the whole realm of life. And you're quite right that by limiting discourse in our churches to just exclusively biblical, religious, spiritual, so-called spiritual issues and concerns, it's a grave disservice to Christians who have to operate in the real world, the wider world, outside of church. And so this really calls for people in ministries that do take on these more comprehensive, wider issues that so many Christians are so concerned about. But as you say, they have no freedom whatsoever to discuss these issues or even bring these issues up in their church. And I think it's quite shameful. But you're absolutely right. That is the reality in most even evangelical churches. This very narrow definition of discipleship as mere pietism.
Jeffrey, if I could respond, Randy here.
Yes, Randy.
Yeah, let me remind you, we all ought to go back and read Ecclesiastes. Fortunately, that's our book in the Baptist church I'm in down here for the next quarter. And just walk away with the idea that there's nothing new under the sun. To the topic of people leaving the church, maybe there's a correlation between what you just spoke about, where all the piety exists and with little regard to the practical things that people face when they walk out the church door, to face the things that are oppressing us today. So I know of people who don't find the kind of sustenance that they need as something like, for example, the full armor of God. They feel they're walking alone or with their little group of agnostic friends, and just going with the flow, but they're totally uncomfortable with that. Well, they don't find it, as you pointed out, several pointed out, they're not getting the power of the gospel preached to them, and so they are afraid. And you mentioned earlier, George, and it was a great presentation. Thank you. You mentioned earlier the deal where someone prayed for cigarettes for the men in the cells and to indicate the presence of God or the provision of God, and cigarettes were delivered. So yesterday, just yesterday, I want to share something with you. Was sent by a young man in our group of some 20 men, Christian men that meet on Monday mornings. He's the youngest. His name is Ryan, and his ministry is in halting sex trafficking in the Atlanta metro area. Really a dangerous thing. But anyway, he brought to our attention an article written on the 22nd of this month, just a few days ago, by one David Daubenmire, Daubenmire, and it's called Cowards Go First. Okay. And it says there is nothing in the world that's more repugnant to Christianity than cowardice. In fact, it is so repulsive to Christ that it's considered worth the death penalty, not just physical, but spiritual death. And he goes on to cite Revelation, and we mentioned eschatology before. Basically, it is a piece that opposes a lack of faith, and opposes any room for fear on the part of Christians, because we have no basis for fear if we're truly anchored into the Spirit of God, and we're totally led by the power of Holy Spirit. And so it's right out there. I Googled it a minute ago. Just Google Cowards Go First. It's a page and a half long. It really gripped me. And what we're to tie those ideas together, it seems that the piety that infects so many churches fails to equip the lay people
right,
who are searching for support. Believe me, they are searching for an anchor, and they're not getting it, and so they're becoming dissatisfied because they're not getting what they need, what they were promised, and what they need, and they have to go out and just fend for themselves, more or less. So I'll just do it. But thank you, George. And one last thing, did check on the idea from last week about the number of teachers in the state of Georgia, even though we're right to work state, the number of teachers in Georgia who are members of the National Education Association. And I talked to the superintendent in our district, and yes, that's true, but they have no way of knowing the number. That's not a question they ask people. Are you a member? They're in no way get to collect the dues and pay the union. If a teacher's a member, they're a member directly and privately.
all right. Well, thank you. And thank you all for being with us these last several weeks. And I'll just end on this note. On page 3 of George's outline for this evening, chapter 10, the gift of suffering, the first sentence in the outline reads, quote, "Modern American culture is allergic to difficulty and suffering." And that's a direct tie-in to our Areopagus seminar that'll begin mid-August. This will be a 12-week seminar on Wednesday evenings. We'll offer it live at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church, but also via Zoom as well. And the topic of our upcoming fall seminar is the theodicy issue. How can a God who is supposedly great and good allow all this suffering and pain and evil in the world? And so it's a very, this will be a very deep dive into a very, very complex issue, but a very, very necessary issue. So the theodicy issue, basically reconciling the realities of God with evil and suffering. So join us on Wednesday evenings if your schedule allows. And again, thank you all for being with us. Wonderful to see you. Yes, Millie, you have the last word.
Well, I just wanted to mention, in the midst of all this, I think we're very blessed in this time to have so many resources, like the Areopagus. I know the Colson Center has excellent resources. You know, I'm a big fan of Al Mohler, sort of educating ourselves on what's going on in the culture. Thursday night, Reasons to Believe, our local chapter will be hosting Ken Samples out of California. I think he's who interviewed you, Jeffrey, several weeks ago. Right. So in the midst of all this, I see God raising up some very strong leaders, and we need to take advantage of that. And we just keep pressing on, whether it's in our small groups or Sunday school classes, our families. I know World Magazine is an excellent resource for our families. I think about you, Jay, with your teenage grandchildren. So in the midst of this, we have a lot of things that God has given to us for this time. So I have a lot of this on the Watchman, so you can check those resources, and I'm sure you all might know of others as well.
Thank you, Millie. Well, good evening to you all, and may God continue to bless and guide and direct all your involvements as we truly seek to be a source of light and truth and hope and love in the midst of a society and culture that's becoming increasingly spiritually dark. So again, thank you for joining us. It's a blessing to be with you all.